Wait, what the? Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and this is the ASRock Rack 1U 2N 2G Rome 2T. I get a total kick out of saying all these names. But this server is something that when it arrived, I thought it was something completely different than it actually was. And then I opened it up and realized, oh my goodness, this is something that's really cool and really unique in the industry. And that is the topic of today's video. Let me give you an idea of why this server is quite unique. Well, one of the reasons is it's a 1U server, but there's definitely been 1U AMD EPYC, Rome, and Milan servers. Definitely lots of those out there. There's a lot of them that have 2 sockets, sure, but this is actually a 1U 2-node server. So there are 2 different servers and distinct servers in this chassis. And that fact alone would make it one of the most unique servers on the market, except for, well, a couple other things. Like, for example, you can see that we have an NVIDIA A40 here because this is actually designed for GPUs in each node. And it's also an ultra cost optimized platform, just not like anything that we've ever seen before. So with that, let's get to the hardware. Okay, looking at the front of the system, it should be immediately obvious that something is different here. Normally, on a server, when you look at the front of the system, especially something that's this deep and like a standard 1U rack mount like depth server, you typically see that you have hot swap bays on the front of a system. Not this one. Instead, you get 2 replicas of like what would normally be rear I/O, except in this case, it's front I/O. For our standard management, we have an out-of-band management port, 2 USB ports, and a VGA port, so you can go hook up a KVM cart to this and do whatever you need to in the data center. And then there are 2 other ports. Now, you might think, oh, those are obviously 1 gig Ethernet ports, right? Nope. They're actually 10G base T ports powered by an Intel X550. Now, of course, they also run at 1 gig speeds, but something you're gonna notice here is that there's no other room for expansion. Everything else is a vent in this system. So you basically have the 2 nodes. You have the node 1 and node 2 on either side of this, but then in the middle, I mean, you can't add more networking onto the front faceplate. So that's definitely very different. But before we get inside the server, let's just take a look at the rear. Now, looking at the back of the server, you're gonna see that we have 2 expansion slots on either side, and each is a double width expansion slot, and that's one goes to each node, and that's where we have this GPU right here is an example where we have one side that's set up that's fully configured, and we have one other side that is completely empty. So just so you can kind of see the 2 different versions, like what it would look like if it's totally full, and one of the other side of what you get kind of with the bare bones server. But you can definitely put a double width GPU, and that's really what this is for. But in terms of the rear of the chassis, the bigger thing is really the power supplies. Now there are 2 1.6 kilowatt redundant power supplies here, and they do provide redundancy. So even if you lose one power supply, you get to use the other power supply, and that is one of the big savings with this platform versus a normal 1U server, because normally if you have a 1U server with redundant power supplies, that means if you want to have like redundant power to a 1U server, it means you have to have 2 power supplies per node, and this has 2 power supplies for 2 nodes and still provides redundancy because each is big enough to handle each of the nodes. And what that practically means is that you need half as many power supplies, which saves on cost, and it's just a much more efficient way to go do it. But the thing you're not going to notice on the back of the system is you're not going to notice anywhere that you could put an expansion card if you have a GPU installed. You're not putting another expansion card in this. So it's actually kind of a unique system that it has a very simple use case. I will say though that we did manage to go and put things like you could put storage, you can put things like network cards or something like that in the back of this if you really wanted to and you didn't want to put a GPU. So it's something that you definitely can do. And the other thing that I'll just say real quick on this is that you also can't put GPUs that are really like consumer cards. You really want either a double width GPU or you want a passive GPU like we have here. We did try this. This is the A40. We also tried it with the A4500 that we just did a mini review of on the STH main site, and both of them did work on here. We didn't get to test it with the A6000 because that had to go back, so we didn't get a chance to do it in the server. And before we get to the motherboard, we're just going to finish off this whole bottom section here because I just want to kind of get there. 2 things that I really want to point out. One is that each side has its own PCIe by 16 slot. These are cabled to the motherboards. We'll see the other end of those cables in a little bit, but that's how they basically get the PCIe back to this section. There's also power for the GPUs that's provided via the power distribution board that's in the middle. This power distribution board is shared. And one of the really fun things is that this shroud that takes the airflow from the fans over the GPU, well, this shroud actually hooks into a little screw that's basically between the power distribution board and the chassis. And I just think that's really kind of an innovative way to go do this. This is actually, I don't love these kind of flimsy shrouds, but this is actually a pretty good solution by ASRock Rack, so I really kind of like that. All right, let's move back up to the top here. And you can see the motherboard over there, and you might say, well, Patrick, haven't we seen that before on STH? And the answer is yes, you have, but not on YouTube. We actually did a main site review of this motherboard a little while ago. This motherboard is the ASRock Rack Rome D4 ID2T, and this motherboard is like a little bit bigger than a mITX motherboard, so it's a little bit deeper. And when you see that motherboard, you're like, why the heck, you know, when we got that motherboard, we reviewed that motherboard, is like cool, but it doesn't really fit in all of the mITX platforms because it's like a little bit too long. But this is probably the reason that motherboard was made. The big feature by far in this is that you actually have an SP3 socket, which means that you can use an AMD EPYC Rome or Milan processor. Now, I know a lot of folks are gonna say like, hey, the Milan processors, they're brand new, or they've been out for a while, but like, you know, doesn't everybody use Milan processors? Well, it turns out that actually there are some segments of the market that still use the Rome generation. We'll talk a little bit about those during the performance section. But the crazy thing about this little motherboard is that it supports not just the kind of low cost, like low 8 cores and, you know, some 16 core parts, it also supports all the way up to things with like 64 cores, Vcache, I mean, all kinds of different processors in this little tiny platform. Now, one of the downsides of this motherboard, because it is really small, remember, this is meant to be half the width of a chassis with some stuff in the middle. So because of that, you can't have your full DIMM complement plus all the other stuff that you need. So that means that we only get 4 DIMMs. You have to remember that the AMD EPYC Rome and Milan parts that go in this motherboard are 8-channel memory. And this only having 4 channels means that, well, we only get half the memory channels, so we can only fill half the memory channels. We'll only ever get like half the memory bandwidth. And also those Rome and Milan parts, they can do 2 DIMMs per channel. And so, you know, like you could get up to 16 DIMMs in a 1-socket server, but this only has 4. So that's a big deal. But in the low-cost markets, especially if you're doing like low-cost hosting or something like that, you don't necessarily need, you know, more DIMMs because you just don't need that capacity. But I guess the other way to look at it is like, you might be thinking like, well, Patrick, you only have 4 channels of memory and you have a GPU server, so like, isn't that like imbalanced? But the other way to think about it is that if you actually have 4 channels of DDR4 3200 for 1 GPU, that's a lot better than having 8 channels of memory for like 4 GPUs or 8 GPUs or something like that you typically see in GPU servers. So this is actually designed, and it's kind of actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because it's designed to have a lot of memory bandwidth and a lot of cores for 1 GPU, not 8, but 1. And the other really cool thing is it allows you to pack these things very densely into racks because you have 2, you know, side-by-side nodes in a single U. And if you're using this for like a hosting market, we have 64 gigabyte DIMMs in here, so that means that we have 256 gigs in this node right here. But you could of course go lower, and you know, you could put like 16 gig DIMMs or something like that if you want to just have like a 64 gigabyte node or something that you're selling like in a dedicated server, dedicated hosting market. You can also go up, I guess, and go to, you know, higher memory if you just really need the capacity for some kind of client or something like that. And it's just, you know, you are limited though that you only get 4 slots. So that is what it is. The other thing though that's kind of weird about this is the storage, because you can see that we have a crucial P5 Plus 2 terabyte drive in here, but that's the only storage that you have. Like, there's no other place. There's no 2.5-inch spot. There's no 3.5-inch spot. You basically are using one M.2 SSD. Now, on the other hand, you do have 10 gig Ethernet, and that's why that 10 gig Ethernet personally is just really important in my mind, because that 10 gig Ethernet gives you at least a way to get network storage at least decently fast. It's not necessarily like 25 gig or something like that these days, but yeah, at the same time, that is a lot better than just 1 gig Ethernet, especially if you can't expand with NICs. So, you know, the fact that you only get one M.2 is kind of a bummer, right? Because, like, you know, if you wanted to have like redundant or something like that, like redundant storage, I guess you can't really do that. Something that the system has though is we have a PCIe Gen 4 by 16 slot, and then there's like a little kind of like little mount point that's next to it. And that little mount point, I would imagine that like if a customer just really needed a second SSD, like really just needed it, I bet you that there's some way that you could get one to fit on some kind of riser combo or something, but it would be kind of hard to like really get one in there. So I don't exactly know what the idea was with that, but you know, it's there. There are like 3 more just kind of interesting things I want to talk about though that you probably wouldn't notice just by looking at this thing, and that's why we have these both set up. So the first one is the fact that you're going to see that all of the power cables, they're actually just kind of like cables, just kind of like standard you know, headers. They're not like on Goldfingers or anything like that. So these are actually not hot swappable nodes. If you remember when we looked at the front of the chassis, it was just kind of a giant faceplate, and so you can't go and hot swap a node. If you want to take this down, well, you're gonna have to pull the node out, open it up, and then service one of the nodes, and that most likely means that you're probably going to be turning off the entire chassis. Again, when I say this is a cost-optimized platform, it goes way beyond just the form factor. It goes beyond just having 4 channels of memory. I mean, it's literally even down to not hot swappable. The second other little fun thing that I wanted to talk about was just if you look at these 2 different nodes. Let me take off the fan shroud here, and you're going to see that we have these nice little fan shrouds that kind of direct air over the CPU through the fan partition and then out through the GPU. And so these are actually, they're flimsy, but they actually work pretty well in the system compared to some of the other 1U systems that we've seen. But one of the things that you'll notice now that I've removed it is that the PCIe cabling is actually different if you're on node 1 or node 2. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because you have 2 nodes that are using the exact same motherboard, but you want to take your PCIe cables and you want to have a shortest run possible. And so you have one that has to run down the left side of the chassis, one that has to run down the right side of the chassis. So you're going to use either the left or the right side PCIe connectors. This has a whole bunch of slimline connectors, and it was actually something that when Will did the motherboard review, he was like, wow, they actually use different kinds of slimline connectors too. So it was actually kind of fun just finding cables when we did that review. But one of the kind of fun things about that is that also means that because all of the PCIe lanes terminate in the CPU, they actually would terminate to different PCIe controllers, whether you're on the node 1 or node 2. Now, like 99.99% of people that would actually use this kind of system, they're just not going to care at all. But if you are looking to optimize like which GPU and which PCIe controller on an EPYC processor you were trying to hit with that GPU, it would actually matter if you were on the node 1 or node 2. Just kind of a weird little thing that you just wouldn't see if you were looking at this and didn't think about it. The third thing though is the fan partition. And something that's just kind of fun on this is that in a lot of systems that we review, you have like hot swappable fans, or at least fans that are kind of like easy to swap out. And often when we review servers these days, the fans are actually controlled by the motherboard and like the fan headers on a motherboard. But that's not what happens in this chassis, because the fans are actually controlled by the power distribution board. So you can actually see on the power distribution board that we have all of the fan headers, and that's actually what powers these fans. Now these are, of course, counter-rotating fans, and they are very nice, pretty decent fans actually. But you'll also notice that here you have like this just giant bar, and this giant bar actually keeps all the fans in place. I think they have to move pretty darn fast to be able to cool a GPU, especially in like a 1U, and to have have air preheated by a CPU and then cooling that GPU. But it's just something that, if a fan did fail, you're undoing screws to be able to get in there. I kind of wish that that was toolless. I also wish that the GPU area was a little toolless, because it feels like there are a couple too many screws there. And so I just kind of, maybe if ASRock does a second version of this, that would be kind of a nice thing. But on the flip side, that also costs more money, and this is a cost optimized platform, so I get it. Now, if you want to see more about the motherboard, we can link that in the description. So you can learn a little bit more about the motherboard. I think Will did the review for this, so we'll link that in the description for this video. One of the interesting things that he found was that this motherboard, and I tested and found the same thing that he saw back then, so I'm gonna give him credit for that, is that Will found that this has a pretty darn slow like media. So if you are using IPMI and you're doing remote media, it can be kind of slow. And so what we did with this, we just used USB drives to provision it, because it was faster. Like, that's what it is. Okay, so let's talk about the performance of this real quick. So personally, to me, I think that the realistic use cases for this are pretty, pretty simple, right? This is a single socket server, and also you only have 4 memory channels. You have 1 GPU. Now, I do know that these motherboards, some of the people that buy these motherboards are people that are looking for 32 to 64 cores, because they're like, hey, that is something that's bigger than what we can get on like socket AM4. And you also can use RDIMMs, ECC RDIMMs, and you get more memory capacity, all that kind of stuff. So it is really for folks that are looking for something that's bigger than the kind of smaller consumer platforms. At the same time, I really think that there are like 2 kinds of CPUs that are most likely going to find their way in this. The first one, I think, are the P-series products, because those are the products that AMD has, or the SKUs that AMD has, that are cost optimized. So they're a little bit less expensive because they only work in single socket servers. In a server like this, you only have a single socket. So I think that makes those SKUs very attractive. The other one though, is that there are a number of 4-channel optimized SKUs. Now these are generally the Rome generation parts. And good examples of those might be like, maybe the 72, like 82 or something like that. Really the lower end parts that were maybe 8 or 16 cores. And those were really optimized for that 4-channel memory operation. And the reason that they were optimized for that was, well, a lot of people at the time were still migrating from Xeon E5 servers where you had 4 memory channels, and they're like, I don't want to pay for 8 DIMMs, so like, Like I just need a couple cores. I'm just upgrading some older Xeon E5. So give me like 8 to 16 cores per socket, give me 4 DIMM channels, and that's all I need. And so there was actually a, long time where that is basically what AMD has recommended. Say, hey, don't go buy the new Milan parts, go buy the lower power, lower cost 7200 series where you actually have that kind of 4-channel optimization. We tested the difference on both the Rome and Milan generation. What would be the impact of having 4-channel memory versus having 8-channel? So literally using this motherboard, using the 4-channel or 8-channel memory optim, and you definitely do see that in some cases you're going to lose a little bit of performance. There's some things though that you actually don't, if you're not really memory bandwidth, maybe you lose 1% or something like that performance, which frankly folks care a lot of times more about the cost versus 1% performance. And then on the flip side of that, there are things that are if you're doing some kind of stream or HPC benchmark that's super bandwidth limited, then maybe you are going to notice that this is an 8-channel memory system. But I think that the idea is that you're basically just using the CPU to feed the GPU in this. And so that's kind of what I really think that this platform is for. So the reason I really wanted to show the difference between the 4-channel and 8-channel is because, I think when we benchmark a lot of the server processors, we always benchmark, using 8-channel memory, but we actually went and did a bunch of these CPUs with only 4-channel memory because we just kind of want to see what the impact was of a system like this. All right, now in terms of power consumption, that is something that people always, there's actually a big deal on this one, right? Because you have 2 nodes, you only have 2 power supplies, they have GPUs, all that kind of stuff. So I can tell you that the A40, which is a pretty darn hot GPU, plus we had a AMD EPYC and we had a 32-core Milan processor in there. Those combined for about 600 watts per side. And then when we got to the lower end CPUs, so we set up a node that had a 7282 and also had an A4500. And when we set that node up, I think we were down into about 400 watts per that side. So when you talk about the power consumption of these, it really just depends so much on which CPUs you're using, which GPUs you're using, and all that kind of stuff. Something that we didn't get to try that I mentioned earlier was we didn't get to try the A6000 in this, which is kind of a bummer because I really wanted to see what a high power blower or, a 300 watt-ish blower GPU would do in this. But unfortunately, we didn't get to really test that. So that's kind of a bummer. But the blower challenge with this is that there's only pretty tight clearances between what you have, with your shroud and the either top or bottom of the case, depending on which side you have the GPU on. So for the passive A40, it worked fine. For the lower power A4500 worked fine, but I don't necessarily know because we didn't get to test it on the higher power blower units. Cool. So what did we learn with this entire platform? Well, I think there are a couple things that I definitely, I came away from this and definitely have noticed, right? The first thing is that this is an ultra cost optimized platform. We have 4-channel memory. We have non-hot swappable nodes, right? There's no expansion on this. You're not going to put extra SSDs. You're probably going to just have one M.2 SSD. So you may not even have a mirrored boot situation. I mean, there is really a lot of cost optimization that went into this platform. And I kind of get it, right? Because there are definitely organizations out there that want a 1 CPU to 1 GPU ratio. They may use those kind of lower power and lower core count CPUs just to kind of keep the cost in line. And maybe they don't necessarily need 8 channels of memory with an 8-core, 16-core CPU. So I could totally see why that works. I mean, the other way to kind of look at it is if you have a 16-core 4-channel memory CPU, well, in a lot of ways, that's kind of better than having a 16-core consumer CPU where you only have 2 memory channels, right? So it is, kind of when you look at it from that angle, I totally can see it. I can also see how it's interesting if you put 32, 48, 64 cores into this platform, have it on each side. I can see why that would be kind of cool to just pack cores in like that. Although, there's also the flip side of that, which is well, why don't you just do a dual socket server? So that's kind of another side to it, but I guess this is maybe less expensive. But to me, the place that this is going to be used the most is probably going to be the dedicated hosting market, where you're just kind of trying to get a low cost solution that you can maybe do some customization if you want to, do for customers, but maybe you're gonna have like a pretty easy set config that works in here. I think for that, this makes a lot of sense because you're saving on, you know, power supplies. You're not buying 2 chassis, you're buying 1 chassis. A lot of the dedicated hosting market guys don't really need that much. I mean, you know, 256 gigs to 512 gigs is probably, you know, a pretty high-end dedicated hosting for a single socket solution. So I think that there are a lot of folks that can use this. To me, the biggest downside is that you do have pretty limited expandability, and also there are a lot of screws that, you know, just like things like the fan partition, getting the GPUs out, all that kind of stuff. That I just kind of wish that, you know, there was a little bit more serviceability would be nice. Overall, though, let's just talk about like why this is so cool, right? I mean, this is a platform that you're not going to see from someone like a Dell or an HPE or something like that. This is a funky little platform that actually makes sense for a whole lot of users. And we have a ton of folks that have been reading STH for years that are in like the dedicated hosting market. They're going to look at this and be like, that's actually kind of a cool design. And I can totally see why ASRock Rack would make something like this. I also think that there's a huge portion of the market that, you know, putting 2 CPUs in one U, they would say, well, why don't you just have a 2-socket server? I totally understand that. But the fact that you can have something where you have a CPU and a GPU, and it's a relatively cost-optimized platform, I totally get it. And it's just cool that something like this gets made. Hey guys, I hope you like this look of an absolutely crazy server. It's definitely one of those ones that just makes me smile. And if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. Our pace of videos is going to pick up a lot over the next couple days. With that, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.